plan was simple. Let the animals finish the job. They wanted it to look like an accident. No evidence. Witnesses. Just a body in the snow. The men walked away, leaving her alone in the freezing forest. Then, she heard something move behind her. At first, just the sound of snow crunching. Then, a low, guttural growl. Slow, heavy, getting closer, too close. She turned her head. That's when she saw it. Just a few feet away, glowing eyes locked onto hers, its breath visible in the cold air watching, waiting, ready to strike. It took one step forward, then, bang, the shot echoed through the forest. The animal froze, then collapsed into the snow. Silence followed. Heavy footsteps approached, calm, measured, unhurried. From the shadows emerged a man, Ma Siwu, known in certain circles as Mora, a man whose name carried weight and fear. To most, he was just a businessman, but in the underworld he was something else entirely. Moments earlier, he had paused, just for a second, not out of doubt, but precision. Hunting wasn't just a hobby to him, it was discipline, preparation, a way to stay sharp for whatever or whoever came next. Out here, in the cold silence of the wild, there were no rules, no lies, just instinct, survival, and Ma Siwu never missed. The forest fell silent again. The last echo of the shot fading into nothing. She didn't move, she couldn't. Slowly, her trembling eyes lifted, and that's when she saw him standing there untouched by the chaos. Calm, composed, watching. For a moment, neither of them spoke. His gaze shifted from the fallen animal to the ropes around her wrists, then back to her eyes. Not fear, not panic. Curiosity, as if he was trying to understand how someone like her ended up like this. Her lips trembled. Please, barely a whisper. But he didn't respond, not yet. He just stood there studying her, like a man who had seen everything and still found this unexpected. Then he took a step closer, and in that moment, her fate was no longer in her hands. Don't miss what happens next. The crunch of snow stopped. Ma Siwu didn't rush to her side. He stood 3 paces away, his long coat catching the wind, looking less like a man and more like a statue carved from the winter itself. Becky's breath came in ragged silver plumes. Her body was screaming for heat, for safety, but her mind was a different story. She watched his hands. She watched the way he held his weight. Even through the haze of near hypothermia, she was calculating. If he moved left, she would roll right. If he raised the gun again, she would use the tree as a shield. She was weak, but she was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a heavy blanket. He didn't reach out. He just studied her, his dark eyes tracing the bruises on her neck and the way the rough hemp had bitten into her skin. Most people would be screaming by now, he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. Screaming wastes oxygen, Becky whispered. Her voice was thin, but her gaze was a blade. And I don't think you're the type to be moved by noise. A flicker of something, perhaps a grim sort of curiosity, crossed his face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tactical knife. Becky didn't see a tool, she saw a weapon. As he leaned in to reach for the ropes at her wrists, her entire body jolted. She flinched, pulling her shoulders tight, her eyes widening with a sharp, instinctive flash of terror. He froze. His hand hovered inches from her arm. "I'm cutting the rope, not the girl." "Heard that before," she hissed, her teeth chattering so hard it hurt. He didn't argue. He moved with clinical precision, the blade slicing through the thick cord with a single, practiced tug. The sudden release made her arms fall limp, the blood rushing back into her fingertips with a stinging, agonizing heat. She let out a choked gasp but didn't let herself collapse. He sheathed the knife and looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "Who did this to you?" Becky looked at the frayed ends of the rope in the snow. She thought of the smiles, the promises, and the cold hands that had tied those knots. She thought of Jamal, but the name stayed locked behind her teeth. "Someone I trusted," she finally said. Ma Siwu tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "A common mistake. Trust is a luxury for people who don't plan on living very long." He didn't offer her his hand. He simply turned toward the tree line. "Can you stand? Or should I leave you for the next thing that comes hunting?" Becky gripped the frozen bark of the tree, her knuckles white. With a guttural sound of pure effort, she forced herself up. She was shaking, but she was upright. "Not staying here," she said. He didn't look back, but he slowed his pace just enough for her to follow. The hunt was over, but for Becky Ferry, the real war was just beginning. The interior of the black SUV smelled of expensive leather and gun oil. Becky sat in the back, huddled against the door, her fingers still throbbing with a phantom heat. To anyone else, she looked like a broken woman rescued from a nightmare. But behind her exhaustion, Becky was cataloging every detail. She watched the two men in the front. They didn't speak. They moved in a synchronized, military-like silence. Then, she shifted her gaze to Ma Siwoo. He sat beside her, his attention fixed on a tablet, yet he felt like a coiled spring. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a fortress. She noticed the way his eyes never stayed on the screen for more than 5 seconds, always flicking to the side mirrors. She saw the subtle bulge of a holster under his coat and the calm, rhythmic tap of his finger on his knee, a man in total control of his environment. "You're calculating the exits," Mora said, his voice cutting through the hum of the engine without him even looking up. Becky didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the window as the snowy trees blurred into the high stone walls of a private estate. "I'm calculating the odds," she corrected. "And the odds say you didn't save me out of the goodness of your heart." Mora finally turned his head, his gaze heavy and analytical. He didn't deny it. He simply watched her as the heavy iron gates groaned open, welcoming them into a world where power was the only currency that mattered. Becky took a breath. She had traded the cold for a cage, but she was already looking for the lock. The car came to a smooth, heavy halt. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. Outside, the estate was a fortress of glass and gray stone, stark against the white landscape. Mora didn't move to open his door immediately. He reached into a small compartment and pulled out a clean silk handkerchief, extending it toward her. Becky looked at it, then at his hand. She didn't take it. Her fingers were still stained with the dark residue of the forest floor, and she preferred the reminder of where she had just been. "You have a habit of looking at everything like it's a puzzle you're about to solve," Mora said. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the command he used with his men. Becky shifted, her muscles stiffening. The warmth of the car was finally hitting her, bringing a wave of exhaustion that threatened to pull her under. "In my world, if you don't solve the puzzle, you become part of the wreckage." He studied her for a long beat, his dark eyes searching for a crack in her armor. "A woman who knows the value of wreckage usually has a name that carries weight. Who are you?" The question hung in the air, cold and sharp. Becky hesitated. Giving a name was a bridge. It was the first step toward being known, and being known was dangerous. But as she looked at the man who had pulled her from the snow, she saw a reflection of her own shadow. "Becky," she finally whispered, her voice steadying. "Becky Ferry." Mora gave a single, slow nod. He didn't offer a platitude or a promise of safety. He simply repeated it once under his breath, as if filing it away in a mental ledger. "Becky Ferry." The first time since the ropes had tightened around her wrists, the crushing weight in her chest eased just a fraction. She wasn't a body in the snow anymore. She was a person again. "Let's get you inside," he said, opening the door. "The cold is finished with you for today." The heat of the estate's guest suite was stifling, a sharp contrast to the memory of the wind. As Becky gripped the edge of a porcelain sink, her reflection caught her off guard. She looked pale, haunted, a far cry from the woman she had been only months ago. Closing her eyes, the sterile white of the bathroom vanished. Suddenly, she was back in the boardroom, the air thick with the scent of expensive coffee and ambition. She was standing at the head of a mahogany table, her voice steady and commanding as she laid out the expansion strategy for the firm. She was the architect of their success, and everyone in that room knew it. "Risks are calculated," she had said, her eyes scanning the partners. "We don't move until the floor is reinforced. If the floor is already rotting, Becky." The voice had been smooth, almost melodic. She remembered turning to see Jamal sitting at the far end of the table. He wasn't a partner yet. He was her protege, the man she had handpicked and mentored. He wasn't aggressive. He looked concerned, devoted, even. "Check the beams myself, Jamal." She had dismissed him with a confident smile. But for the first time, the room hadn't laughed with her. They had looked at Jamal. He hadn't pushed back. He just gave a small, supportive nod that felt like a pitying pat on the back. It was a tiny crack, a single brick loose in her fortress. She had ignored it then, moved by the warmth of the man who always stayed late to help her double-check her files. She hadn't realized he wasn't checking her work. He was learning her ghost. In those early months, Jamal wasn't just a colleague. He was the mirror Becky used to see her own brilliance. He had a way of leaning against her office door, arms crossed, watching her work with an expression that bordered on reverence. To a woman who had built her career on armor and sharp edges, his softness was a dangerous relief. "You see things no one else sees, Becky," he'd whispered one night, sliding a cup of tea onto her desk as the city lights twinkled 30 stories below. The way you dismantle a competitor's logic, it's like watching a master at a chessboard. He didn't just admire her mind, he studied it. He asked her how she anticipated market shifts, how she read the hidden motives in a contract, and how she knew exactly when to strike. And Becky, fueled by the rare intoxication of being truly understood, gave him the keys to the kingdom. She taught him her rhythm, her blind spots, and her secrets. She remembered the way he'd look at her, not with the cold calculation of the partners, but with a warmth that made her feel safe enough to lower her guard. She started leaving her laptop unlocked when she went for coffee. She started sharing the strategies she hadn't even whispered to the board. In a world of predators, she thought she had finally found a partner. She didn't realize she was just training her own replacement. The shift was almost invisible, a hairline fracture in a diamond. It happened late one Thursday, the office hushed except for the hum of the HVAC. Becky was leaning over a spread of market analytics, tracing the vulnerability in their competitors' supply chain. It was her masterpiece, a strategy that would consolidate their power for a decade. Jamal was behind her, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. It was a gesture she had grown to find comforting, but tonight, the air felt different. As she explained the final move, he didn't just nod in admiration, he began to probe. "And the offshore accounts used for the hedge?" he asked, his voice casual, yet his eyes stayed fixed on the specific line of code she had highlighted. "If the audit hits early, where is the pivot point?" Becky paused, a small instinct prickling at the back of her neck. It was a brilliant question, too brilliant. It was the kind of question an assassin asks about the thickness of a target's vest. "Pivot is manual, Jamal. Only I have the key," she said, turning to look at him. He didn't blink. He just smiled, that same warm, supportive smile she had come to rely on. But for a split second, the warmth didn't reach his eyes. They remained cold, calculating the distance between her hand and the keyboard. "Of course," he whispered. "I just want to make sure you're protected, Becky. I don't know what the firm would do without you." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He wasn't looking at her as a partner anymore. He was looking at her as an obstacle. The glass-walled conference room felt like a vacuum. Becky stood at the head of the table, her digital presentation glowing behind her. This was the launch of the Phoenix Project, the culmination of 6 months of sleepless nights. She began to speak, her voice steady, waiting for the familiar nods of approval from the board, but the silence was wrong. "Logic is flawed, Becky," one of the senior partners interrupted, his voice flat. "The entry point you've identified is already saturated. We'd be liquidated in 48 hours. Becky blinked, her heart stuttering. "That's impossible. I've run these simulations." "Actually," a smooth voice cut in from the side. Jamal stood up, holding a tablet. "I took the liberty of running a secondary diagnostic last night. It seems the data Becky used was outdated." He tapped the screen, and a new set of figures appeared on the wall, her figures, but twisted, refined, and undeniably superior. It was a more aggressive, perfect version of her own soul's work. The partners leaned in, their eyes lighting up with greed. Becky turned to Jamal, her breath hitching. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the board, his posture humble yet commanding. When she finally caught his eye, searching for the man who had promised to protect her, he looked away. He didn't defend her. He didn't even acknowledge her. In that moment, the room didn't just reject her plan, they erased her. She wasn't the architect anymore. She was just the woman standing in Jamal's shadow. The days that followed were a slow, quiet freezing. Becky's office, once the heartbeat of the firm, became a tomb. The morning briefings started without her. The group emails stopped arriving. When she walked through the glass-walled corridors, her colleagues, people she had mentored and defended, suddenly found intense interest in their phone screens or the floor tiles. She was a ghost in high heels. She retreated to the break room, her hand trembling as she reached for a coffee pod. 2 junior analysts were whispering by the window. As soon as they saw her, the silence was instant, heavy with the stench of pity and professional death. They hurried out, leaving her alone with the hum of the refrigerator. Jamal was the only one who still spoke to her, but his words were like silk wrapped around a razor. He would drop by her desk at 6 p.m., his face a mask of weary concern. "Board is just stressed, Becky," he'd say, leaning against the doorframe she used to own. "They don't mean to shut you out, they need results right now, and the Phoenix Project failure hit them hard." He reached out, squeezing her shoulder. His touch, once a source of strength, now made her skin crawl. He was emotionally distant, his eyes already looking past her toward the corner office that was being cleared of her awards. "Doing what I can to smooth things over," he whispered. "But maybe you should take some time. You're not thinking clearly lately." He left her there in the dim light of the dying office, more alone than she had ever been in her life. Confusion gnawed at her. How had the man who loved her mind become the man who was burying it? The late afternoon sun bled through the blinds of Becky's apartment, casting long, cage-like shadows across the floor. She hadn't been to the office in 3 days. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional vibration of her phone. When Jamal finally called, his voice wasn't the cold tone of a corporate rival. It was the soft, melodic comfort of the man she had fallen for. He sounded breathless, worried, like a man who had been fighting battles on her behalf. "Becky, listen to me," he whispered, the background noise suggesting he was tucked away in a private corner of the firm. "The board is talking about a formal severance. I can't stop them if you're sitting there in the dark. You're spiraling and they see it." Becky gripped the phone, her knuckles white. "I'm not spiraling, Jamal. I'm being erased." "I know, and I have a plan to fix it," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "There's a silent partner, a private investor who holds 40% of the firm's debt. He's staying at a retreat upstate. If you can pitch the original Phoenix project to him, without the errors I found, he can overrule the board. He's a purist. He'll love your mind, Becky." A spark of hope, dangerous and bright, flared in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe that the last year hadn't been a lie. "Upstate, now. Tonight," Jamal insisted. "I've already cleared the meeting. I'll text you the coordinates. Please, Becky, do this for us, for everything we built." She stared at the packed suitcase in the corner of her room. She didn't see the trap. She saw a lifeline. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll go." "Good," Jamal said, and for the first time his voice sounded perfectly calm. "I'll see you on the other side." The GPS led her deep into a cathedral of pines, where the pavement turned to gravel and then to dirt. Becky killed the engine, the silence of the forest pressing against the car windows like a physical weight. There was no retreat, no private investor, only the skeletal shadows of trees and the biting chill of a world without streetlights. She stepped out, her breath hitching as the cold lunged at her. "Hello," she called out, her voice swallowed by the dark. The ambush was silent. Before she could turn, a heavy hand clamped over her mouth. Another gripped her waist, dragging her back toward a thick ancient pine. She fought, kicking and scratching, but the ropes were ready. They looped around her chest and wrists, biting into her skin with a cruel, rhythmic finality. Then the footsteps approached. Calm, measured, familiar. A flashlight beam cut through the dark, blinding her. As her eyes adjusted, the silhouette resolved into the one person who shouldn't have been there. Jamal. She gasped, her voice thick with a terror that tasted like copper. He didn't rush to her. He didn't look panicked. He stood 5 feet away, dressed in a heavy wool coat, looking at her with the same analytical gaze he used for a spreadsheet. "You taught me everything, Becky," he said, his voice as smooth as the tea he used to bring her. He stepped into the light and she saw it. The warmth was gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollow clarity. "I just learned how to use it better." She choked out, the word breaking in her throat. "I loved you. I built you." "That's the problem, Becky," he whispered, leaning in close enough for her to smell his cologne. "You built me so well that I don't need the architect anymore. You're the only person left who knows where the bodies are buried, so I decided to give you one of your own." He turned away, not looking back as the shadows claimed him. He didn't hate her. He simply didn't need her. And that was the coldest betrayal of all. The headlights of Jamal's car cut a cruel path through the falling snow, illuminating Becky's bound form like a specimen on a board. He didn't leave immediately. He leaned against the hood, lighting a cigarette, the orange glow reflecting in his calm, dark eyes. "You know what the worst part is, Becky?" he asked, his voice conversational as if they were still debating a merger over dinner. "It wasn't even hard. I didn't have to hack your accounts or bribe the board. I just had to wait for you to trust me." Becky's breath came in ragged, sobbing hitches, the rough bark of the tree scraping her spine. "I trusted you because I loved you, Jamal. That's not a weakness. It's a variable," he interrupted, flicking ash into the snow. "A predictable, messy variable. You were brilliant, Becky, truly, but you were predictable. You thought the world operated on merit and loyalty. I knew it operated on leverage." He stepped closer, the smell of tobacco and expensive wool filling her senses. He reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, a gesture so tender it made her want to scream. "I've already moved into your office," he whispered. The board thinks you've had a nervous breakdown and fled the country. By tomorrow morning, the Phoenix Project will be mine. And you'll just be a tragic accident in the woods." He didn't shout. He didn't gloat with the fire of a villain. He was simply done with her. He turned, got into the car, and drove away, the red taillights bleeding into the darkness until there was nothing left but the cold and the silence. He hadn't just taken her life, he had erased her existence. The red taillights vanished, leaving a suffocating darkness. The cold was no longer a sensation, it was a weight pressing into Becky's lungs. But as the wind howled, her heartbreak began to freeze into a jagged, cold resolve. Jamal had banked on her grief, keeping her still. He was wrong. When a low growl vibrated through the air, Becky didn't flinch. She watched the shadow move with a detached, clinical focus. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a strategist measuring a threat. Then came the crunch of boots. Mora appeared, moving with a silent, terrifying precision. As he drew a blade to cut her bindings, Becky didn't just see a savior. She saw a system. She noted the tactical grip on his knife and the absolute discipline in his silence. This was a man who operated entirely outside the law. As the ropes fell, Becky didn't collapse. In the heat of the SUV, she sat in total silence, her mind already whirring. She began a mental audit, reciting encrypted account paths and hidden backdoors Jamal didn't know existed. He had made one mistake. He left the architect alive. As the car sped away, Becky wasn't just surviving. She was calculating the exact moment the floor would drop out from under him. The guest suite at Mora's estate was a fortress of marble and silence. Becky sat by the fire, a thick wool blanket draped over her shoulders. To any observer, she looked like a woman hollowed out by trauma, pale, trembling, and fragile. But behind her glazed eyes, the architect was back at work. She allowed herself to look at the cracks she had ignored. She remembered the subtle probes, Jamal asking about the secondary encryption keys over dinner, the faint notification of a login from an unauthorized IP address while she was in a board meeting. He hadn't just betrayed her, he had been harvesting her for months. But Jamal had forgotten one thing. Becky never put all her weight on a floor she hadn't reinforced herself, long before the Phoenix Project. She had built a shadow archive, a parallel system designed to catch the data that shouldn't exist. It wasn't a corporate backup, it was a ghost. She hadn't fully trusted the firm's security, and deep down, perhaps she hadn't fully trusted the man who claimed to love her. Mora entered the room, his presence heavy and demanding. He stood by the hearth, watching her with a clinical curiosity. "You've been staring at that flame for an hour," he noted. "Most people in your position would be begging for a phone to call the police. What do you need?" Becky didn't look up. Her voice was a low, steady rasp. "I don't need a phone, and I don't need the police." She turned her gaze to him, and for a split second the mask of the victim slipped, revealing the predator beneath. "I need access, an unsecured line, no footprint." It wasn't a plea, it was a requirement. Mora gave a slow, measured nod, acknowledging the power move. Late that night, while the estate slept, Becky sat before a terminal in Mora's private study. The blue light of the monitor reflected in her dark eyes as her fingers danced across the keys with practiced speed. She bypassed the standard protocols, reaching deep into the dark fiber of the web until a single, blinking cursor appeared. She entered a sequence of 24 characters, a key Jamal didn't know existed. The screen flickered, then went black, save for a small, golden icon in the corner. Becky leaned back, a cold smile touching her lips. She wasn't just back in the game. She was the only one who knew the board had a second level. In the corner office that once belonged to Becky, Jamal sat behind the mahogany desk, the city skyline sprawling behind him like a conquered kingdom. He was the picture of tailored confidence, sipping a vintage scotch as he reviewed the final merger documents. The transition had been seamless. The board was enamored, and the tragedy of Becky's breakdown was already fatting into corporate lore. Then, the first shadow crossed his screen. A high-frequency trade for the Phoenix Project's primary fund didn't just stall, it reversed. A notification followed, inconsistent authorization path. Jamal frowned, his fingers tapping a rhythmic beat on the desk. It was a glitch, surely. But as he refreshed the ledger, a second red flag bloomed. The audit trails for the offshore holdings were drifting. The numbers on the screen didn't match the hard copies in his vault. By noon, the silent pressure began. A cryptic email arrived from the lead investor, a man who valued discretion above all else. Internal discrepancies noted in the Phase 2 projections. Clarify by end of day. Away, in the cold blue light of Mora's study, Becky watched the digital dominoes fall. She wasn't hacking into the system. She was simply watching the triggers she had embedded months ago finally snap shut. She hadn't left a bomb. She had built a floor that only stayed level if she was the one standing on it. "You don't destroy a system from the outside," she whispered to the empty room, her eyes cold and predatory. "You let it collapse from what it trusts most." Back in the office, Jamal loosened his tie. He wasn't panicking, not yet. He was a master of logic, and logic dictated this was a technical error. He opened the raw server logs, his eyes scanning the code for a breach, but there was no intruder. There was only the ghost of Becky's architecture, quietly withdrawing its support, leaving him standing on nothing but air. The collapse wasn't a bang. It was a rhythmic digital execution. By 9 a.m., the board of directors received an anonymous, encrypted dump. It wasn't a hack. It was the original, unaltered Phoenix Project files, time-stamped months before Jamal's discovery. The evidence was surgical. It showed Becky's architecture, and more damningly, the digital fingerprints of Jamal's manual alterations. The reversal was instantaneous. In a chilling mirror of Becky's own downfall, Jamal's world turned to glass. The morning briefing was canceled without his knowledge. His keycard blinked red at the executive elevator. When he walked through the glass-walled corridors, the analysts who had once scrambled for his favor now looked at their phones, their silence heavy with professional execution. He was a ghost in a bespoke suit. He retreated to his office, only to find two grim-faced men from the compliance board waiting. His corporate accounts were frozen. His merger was now a fraud investigation. As they let him out, his phone vibrated in his pocket. A single private link video file. He opened it with trembling fingers. The screen remained black, but a voice, clear, steady, and terrifyingly alive, filled his ear. "You didn't beat me, Jamal," Becky's voice whispered, devoid of heat or hatred. "You just made your move first, and in this game, the first move is always the loudest mistake." Line went dead as the elevators opened to a lobby filled with waiting authorities. His reputational collapse was total, his financial ruin absolute, cut back to the quiet, snow-dusted serenity of the Mora estate. Becky stood by the window, watching the horizon. The weight she had carried since the woods was gone, replaced by a terrifying, calm clarity. Mora stepped into the room, his shadow long against the marble floor. He watched her for a long moment, a rare, genuine respect in his eyes. "You dismantled a man who thought he controlled the world," he said quietly. He paused, his gaze sharpening. "But Jamal was just a sentinel. Tell me, Becky, what happens when the system above him notices you're still breathing?" Becky didn't flinch. She didn't even look away from the rising sun. She simply turned her head slightly, a cold, predatory smile touching her lips. "Then," she said, her voice like cracking ice, "I change the game again." Betrayal was meant to be her end, but in the frozen silence, Becky Ferry found a sharper version of herself. Jamal took her legacy, but he couldn't replicate her mind. Now the board is reset and the real game begins. He didn't beat her. He just made the first mistake.